The world was a tapestry of gold and emerald. For 3 centuries, the sun had been a kind father. The high Middle Ages breathed with a steady and rhythmic pulse. Wheat grew tall and heavy in the fields of Europe. The granaries were bursting with the bounty of a warming earth. Great cathedrals rose like stone prayers toward a smiling heaven. Cities expanded their walls to hold the rising tide of life. The population had tripled since the time of Charlemagne. Men believed they had finally mastered the wild spirit of the world. Trade routes stretched across the continent like silver veins. Spices moved from the east, while wool flowed from the west. It was a season of unprecedented stability. It was a dream of eternal spring. Then the sun turned cold. The year was 1315. The sky did not wake up with its usual golden eye. Instead, it wore a shroud of bruised purple and weeping gray. The rain began as a soft and rhythmic drumming. By the second week, the drumming had become a roar. It did not stop. It poured for days. It poured for weeks. It poured for months. The earth could no longer drink the sky. The soil turned into a thick and suffocating soup. Fields of grain became lakes of black rot. The crops drowned where they stood. The roots turned to slime beneath the surface. The harvest of 1315 simply ceased to exist. Men watched from their windows as their livelihoods dissolved into the mud. The price of bread rose by 300% in a single month. The salt mines flooded, and the salt became more precious than gold. Without salt, there was no way to preserve the meat of the autumn slaughter. The meat turned green and pulsed with maggots. The hunger began as a dull ache in the belly of the poor. Soon it became a screaming demon that lived in every rib cage. People began to eat the horses they needed for the plow. Then they ate the dogs that guarded their doors. Then they ate the cats that hunted the mice. Rumors began to drift through the rain like toxic smoke. They whispered of mothers who looked at their children with hollow eyes. They whispered of graves being opened in the dead of night. Desperation had stripped away the thin lacquer of civilization. The law died in the mud. The church offered prayers, but the rain only fell harder. The priests told the people it was a punishment for their sins. The people looked at the empty altars and felt only a cold and biting void. The year 1316 arrived with no relief. The spring was a ghost of ice and freezing sleet. The ground was too sodden to take the seed. The cattle died of murrain, and their carcasses bloated in the flooded valleys. The stench of decay was the only constant in the air. The Great Famine was not a moment of crisis, but a slow and agonizing erosion. It lasted for 7 years of bitter and relentless misery. Millions of souls were extinguished by the simple absence of a crust of bread. Those who survived were no longer the people they once were. Their bones were brittle and their hearts were hardened like flint. The social contract was shredded into bloody ribbons. Feudal lords could no longer protect those who worked their land. Kings found their treasuries empty and their authority rotting. The Great Famine was the hammer that cracked the foundation of the world. But the climate collapse was only the beginning of the darkness. The weather had shifted permanently into the Little Ice Age. The cooling of the Northern Hemisphere changed the chemistry of the soul. Security was replaced by a permanent and shivering anxiety. The Golden Age was not just over. It was being erased by a cold and indifferent universe. Children born in this era never knew the taste of a full stomach. They grew up stunted and pale and prone to every passing fever. The immune systems of an entire continent were being systematically dismantled. The population was a hollowed-out husk waiting for a spark. Humanity was huddled in the dark and praying to a silent sky. They did not know that the famine was merely the vanguard. They did not know that the earth was preparing a much more brutal lesson. The mud was a graveyard for the dreams of the medieval mind. The stability of the cathedrals felt like a mockery of the chaos outside. Every bridge was washed away by the rising black rivers. Every road became a trap of waist-deep filth. The nobility retreated to their stone keeps and bolted the iron doors. But hunger knows how to climb walls. Revolution began to simmer in the bellies of the starving peasantry. The hierarchy of the world was leaning precariously toward the abyss. Nature had withdrawn its favor. The sun had become a stranger. The rain carried the taste of iron and ancient tears. This was the shattering of the great chain of being. The human spirit was being forged in a furnace of ice. They had forgotten what it felt like to be warm. They had forgotten what it felt like to be safe. The great forests grew dark and reclaimed the abandoned villages. The wolves returned to the outskirts of the great cities. They waited for the weak to fall in the frozen streets. Civilization was shrinking back into the shadows. The light of the high Middle Ages had been snuffed out by a wet and heavy hand. Man was once again a frightened animal in a world that wanted him dead. The Great Famine of 1315 was a warning. It was the first trumpet of the apocalypse. It taught the world that the earth does not care for the titles of kings. It taught the world that life is a fragile and fleeting spark. The survivors looked at one another with the eyes of ghosts. They were ready for the end, and the end was traveling toward them on the backs of fleas. The tragedy of the 14th century was gaining its terrible momentum. The shattering was complete. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy. The rain finally slowed, but the world remained cold. The harvest remained thin, and the hearts remained heavy. This was the threshold of the dark. This was the edge of the world's most violent transformation. The silence of the fields was the loudest sound in the history of man. No birds sang in the winter of 1317. Only the wind howled through the ribs of the dead. The Golden Age was a memory of a different planet. The reality was iron and ice and the coming of the scythe. The ships arrived at the port of Messina like ghost vessels drifting on a sea of oil. They carried a cargo more precious than gold and more heavy than lead. Death was the stowaway. It did not come with a roar. It came with a whisper in the bilge. The black rats scurried down the ropes into the unsuspecting heart of the world. They carried the invisible fire in their blood. The year was 1347. The world was about to break. The first sign was a fever that burned like an internal sun. Then came the swellings in the groin and the armpits. They were called buboes. They were the size of an apple or a common egg. They were the black blossoms of a garden of agony. If they burst, you might live. If they remained hard and dark, you were a corpse within 3 days. The blood turned to ink beneath the skin. The breath became a weapon of poison. The stench was a physical wall that blocked the gates of the soul. No one knew where it came from. Some said the stars had aligned in a configuration of malice. Some said the earth had opened its mouth in the east and exhaled the breath of hell. The truth was smaller and more terrifying. The truth was living in the fur of a flea. Europe was a crowded house of wood and filth. The plague did not knock. It tore the doors off the hinges. In Florence, the dead were piled high like cordwood. The living were too few to bury them. The city of light became a city of shadows. The bells stopped ringing because the bell ringers were gone. Silence was the only music left in the streets. The social order did not just bend. It shattered like glass hit by a hammer of iron. Families were the first to fail. A father would look at his son and see only a source of infection. Mothers abandoned their infants in the straw. Wives fled from their husbands while they still breathed. The blood tie was thinner than water in the face of the great dying. The law became a memory. The courts were empty. The guards were skeletons in armor. Gold lost its luster when there was no one to bake the bread. A king's crown was worth less than a dry crust of wheat. The feudal system was the spine of the world. The plague snapped that spine in two. The peasants who survived looked at the empty fields. They saw that the lords were just as mortal as the serfs. The illusion of divine right perished in the plague pits. Labor became a treasure more rare than diamonds. The few who remained demanded a price the nobility could not pay. The world was turning upside down. The masters were becoming the servants. The servants were becoming the masters of their own destiny. But the greatest collapse was not of the body or the state. It was the collapse of the spirit. The church was the sun around which all life orbited. It promised protection. It promised a bridge to the divine. When the plague hit, the bridge collapsed. The priests died faster than the sinners. The holy water was a stagnant pool of failure. The Pope retreated behind a wall of torches in Avignon. He sat between two great fires to keep the air pure. The people looked to the heavens and saw only a cold and empty sky. They asked why God had abandoned his children. There was no answer but the sound of the shovel hitting the dirt. The church's monopoly on truth vanished in the smoke of the crematoriums. Some turned to the whip. The flagellants marched from town to town. They beat their own backs until the cobblestones ran red with blood. They sang hymns of terror. They sought to appease a god they believed was a butcher. They were a parade of madness in a landscape of despair. Others turned to the feast. They drank until they forgot their names. They danced in the ruins. They made love in the shadow of the gallows. If tomorrow was a grave, then today was a carnival. This was the danse macabre, the dance of death. The art of the time changed forever. The paintings showed skeletons leading emperors by the hand. The skull was the new face of beauty. Death was no longer a distant event. Death was a roommate. Death was a lover. Death was the only constant in a shifting sea of horror. By the time the first wave receded, 25 million people were gone. 1/3 of the continent was a cemetery. The brushwood grew over the abandoned villages. The wolves returned to the plazas of great cities. The air was thinner. The world was quieter. The medieval mind was wounded beyond repair. The old certainties were buried in the mass graves of 1348. The collapse of the church led to the birth of doubt. The collapse of the social order led to the birth of the individual. From the ashes of the burning bodies, a new world was struggling to be born. But that birth was agonizing. The scars of the plague would remain for 500 years. The memory of the black swellings was etched into the DNA of the West. We are the children of the survivors. We are the descendants of those who looked into the abyss and did not blink. The Great Mortality was the ultimate filter. It stripped away the vanity of the Middle Ages. It left a raw and bleeding humanity. The dance continued long after the music stopped. The skeletons are still dancing in the walls of our cathedrals. They remind us that the world can end in a week. They remind us that the crown and the plow are equal in the dirt. The year 1350 was a year of ghosts. The survivors walked through a world they no longer recognized. The sun rose over a landscape of empty houses and silent bells. The tragedy was complete. The disintegration was total. The dance of death was the only thing that felt real, and the shadows were growing longer. The nightmare was not over. It was merely taking a breath. The world in ruins was the new foundation, and on that foundation, we built our modern world. We built it on the bones of the 25 million. We built it in the wake of the total collapse. The story of the 14th century is the story of the end of the world. And the terrifying truth is that the world kept spinning. The dance goes on. It always goes on. One sentence, one body, one grave at a time. The Black Plague was the signature of a dark god. The ink was blood. The parchment was the skin of the dying. The history of man is written in the gaps between the heartbeats. And in the middle of the 14th century, the heart of the world almost stopped forever. The silence was the loudest thing left in the world. It sat heavy on the fallow fields of Europe. It choked the empty halls of the great cathedrals. The air no longer carried the sound of the plow. The village squares were stages for a play with no actors. The Great Death had taken its fill and finally retreated into the shadows. But the world it left behind was unrecognizable. The 14th century had broken the back of history. Everything that had been true for 1,000 years was now a lie. The survivors blinked in the harsh light of a new dawn. They were fewer in number, but greater in weight. Before the pestilence, a man was worth less than the mud on his boots. He was a tethered ghost in the machine of the feudal lords. He was a piece of property with a soul. He lived and died within the same 5 miles of dirt. The Lord owned the land and the Lord owned the labor. Then the reaper leveled the playing field. The plague did not respect the heraldry of the brave. It did not pause at the gates of the gilded palace. It ate the duke as hungrily as it ate the beggar. When the bells stopped tolling, the arithmetic of power had shifted. Labor was no longer a commodity found in abundance. Labor was now a precious metal. The fields were screaming for hands to harvest the grain. The lords looked out from their battlements and saw a kingdom of weeds. They called for the peasants to return to their toil, but the peasants did not move. They looked at their own hands and realized they held the keys to the kingdom. The supply of human sweat had plummeted. The demand for survival had reached a fever pitch. For the first time in an eternity, the poor had leverage. They demanded wages that would have been a fantasy a decade prior. They demanded the right to walk away from the soil of their birth. The lords tried to pass laws to chain them back down. They tried to freeze time with ink and parchment. But you cannot legislate against a vacuum. The vacuum of the dead pulled the living toward freedom. The feudal system began to crumble under the weight of its own emptiness. It was a slow-motion collapse of a mountain of stone. The bonds of serfdom were snapped by the simple need for bread. If one lord would not pay, the next lord surely would. Competition was born from the womb of the mass grave. The individual was rising from the collective heap. This was the first tremor of a revolution that would take centuries to finish. It was the accidental birth of the human being as a person. Before the plague, you were your rank. After the plague, you were your potential. The survivors found themselves in a world with more resources and fewer mouths. There was more land for those who remained. There was more meat on the table. There was more iron in the forge. The standard of living for the lowest soul began to climb. They wore better clothes and ate better grain. They began to look at the horizon with eyes that were no longer downcast. The church had promised them a paradise in the next life, but the survivors wanted a taste of it in this one. The monopoly of the soul was also under threat. The priests had died in the same gutters as the thieves. The holy water had not washed away the boils. The great intermediary was found wanting. Men began to read the stars and the dirt for themselves. They began to look at medicine not as a prayer, but as a puzzle. They started to count, to measure, and to observe. The failure of the old ways forced the invention of the new. If the gods would not save the body, the mind would have to try. Technology became the surrogate for the lost millions. If you do not have 10 men to pull the rope, you build a machine. The scarcity of muscle led to the genius of the gear. Windmills and water wheels began to hum with a new purpose. Printing presses would soon follow to fill the void of the scribes. The world was getting faster because it had been forced to stop. Money began to change its shape as well. Land was no longer the only measure of a man's worth. Gold flowed into the hands of the merchant and the weaver. The city became the magnet for the ambitious and the desperate. The urban sprawl was the nursery of the modern mind. In the city, you were not defined by your father's plow. You were defined by what you could make and what you could sell. The middle class was a ghost that began to take on flesh. They were the children of the catastrophe. They were the architects of a world built on trade instead of tribute. We think of the Renaissance as a golden age of art and light, but its roots were buried deep in the black rot of the 1300s. The beauty of the Sistine Chapel was paid for by the blood of the pestilence. The rebirth required a death. The modern concept of human rights began in that dark mud. It began with the radical idea that a man's life had a price. It began with the notion that the state served the living, not the other way around. We are the descendants of the lucky few who didn't cough blood. We live in the house that was built from the ruins of the manor. Every liberty we take for granted was forged in that furnace. Every scientific breakthrough was a response to that ancient helplessness. The 14th century was the darkest tunnel in human history. But the light at the end of it was the sun of the modern age. We did not plan this revolution. We did not vote for this change. We stumbled into the future because the past had died. The phoenix did not just rise, it clawed its way out. It left the feathers of the old world in the fire. It took to the sky on wings made of scars, and as it flew, the shadows of the lords and the kings grew small. The world was no longer a prison of rank. It was a map waiting to be drawn. The story of the survival of the few is the story of us. It is the story of how the end of the world was just a beginning. It is the story of how we learned to value the heartbeat, one life at a time, one right at a time, one step out of the grave at a time. The nightmare was finally over. The dream of the modern world had just begun, and the cost was only everything we used to be. The ink is dry now, the bones are dust, but the freedom remains. It is the inheritance of the survivors. It is the legacy of the empty fields. It is the fire from the ashes.